Good afternoon. My name is Mark Kilgore. I'm the lead dam safety engineer for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And myself, along with several members of my team, will be guiding you through two grant processes today. The first will be the Dam Safety Flood and Prevention Assistance Fund, which is a state-based matching program providing 50% match. And the second will be a federal program under FEMA called the High Hazard Potential Dam Grant, or HHPD grant. And that one is, unless you're a corporation or a municipality or meet certain provisions of the tax code like a formal HOA, you would normally have a local sponsor for some grants like that. Next slide, please. So now we're going to do our first poll. I think we've got 3 questions on the screen, and I don't think it'll allow the panel to vote. I'm sorry about that. Something just happened in a remote part of my house. But anyway, so have you ever applied for a dam safety grant before? Yes and was awarded. Choice 2 is yes but not awarded, or choice 3, have not applied before. I think Arthur's going to give me.
Yeah, folks, I don't know if folks can see the responses, but we have about 30% saying yes, they were awarded, and 60% not applying before, and only 6% applied but were not awarded. So about 1/3 were awarded and 2/3 have not even applied before.
Very good. Okay, thank you all for participating. Next slide. And here we go. So we have a total of 3 of these webinars. Please note that your written responses and your audio questions at the end of the webinar are recorded. And you can go back and review the webinar after the fact. I believe a link to the webinar that you attended will be sent out afterwards within a couple days. And depending on the demand, we may also hold office hours for further questions as we reach the latter part of our application period, which ends on March 15th. And we do have a web link where you can monitor additional sessions, and that web link is shown at the bottom of the slide. You can probably also Google that with dam-safety-funding DCR DAM. Next slide. So today we're going to have a number of topics. You can see the agenda on the screen. I won't bother going through every one, since really it's the presentation that's the added value here. And we will have a middle period at the end of the first half of the presentations for a question and answer chat, and then another one at the very end. And some of us don't have a hard stop at 3:30. and may be able to stick around a little later if we get short on time, or excuse me, 4. Next slide. As you may be aware, the Commonwealth is split up into 5 different regions. We're hoping to actually expand to 7 regions, depending on our own state grant funding. But for now, we have all 5 regions staffed by professional engineers with a lot of experience in dam safety engineering. And most of your technical questions can be fielded by them. If you have procedural questions or eligibility questions, that's something that our grants staff under the leadership of Jake Shaw would be able to answer. Next slide. This is the team for today. Scott is the Region 3 engineer. Jake is our grants manager. Charles Wilson is one of the leading engineers in the district's dam safety program, the Soil and Water Conservation Districts. You've already heard from Arthur, our mapping and data analyst. Aaron Bish is a mapping engineer and water resources modeler. Steve Bricker is our Southwest Virginia Region 4 engineer. Kimberly Gaines is a specialist in grants and supports Jake. And Scott Peterson is also a specialist. And finally, if you have any needs for support using our Dam Safety Inventory System, or DSIS, Melissa is the primary person providing assistance on the mechanics of using it. And again, if you have questions about the technical content within DSIS, those are best answered by your regional engineer. Next slide, please. So we already talked about this recording and the slides being sent out later. You can type your questions as they arise in the chat window, which are being monitored by a couple of our support staff, and we'll do our best to answer them during the presentation or at the designated breaks. We'll go verbal at the end of the training when we can have folks that might be using a phone to connect or have difficulty with the chat window, and you'll be able to ask your questions at the end of the presentation. You can raise your hand using the little hand icon. Next slide. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Arthur for a brief overview.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So yeah, I'm just going to discuss an overview of the State Dam Safety Flood Protection and Prevention Assistance Fund and the FEMA High Hazard Potential Dam Grant programs, and just kind of compare these two, since we do have a timeline where they're both kind of lining up. So there's the potential for different types of applicants to apply for different grant programs. So on the left-hand side, we have the State Dam Safety Grant Program. So I'm going to read down this. So for the process, the dam owners will submit directly and apply directly to DCR, and there's a total of $10.6 million. The match is a 50% match requirement, and for eligibility, it can be private or local government dams. State agencies are not covered by this grant. One of the requirements is typically to have an O&M certificate, and generally we would want that at the very least by the application deadline. So the deadline is March 15th, and the period of performance is a 24-month period with a ability to apply for a 12-month extension, and reimbursements are typically done as lump sum reimbursements. So on the FEMA Dam Safety Grant side, the process is a little different. DCR will be coordinating with eligible dam owners and submitting a statewide application to FEMA. The total fund is $185 million nationwide, and we don't have our state allocation yet, but we're projecting $2 million, and hopefully it could be a little bit larger. The match is a 35% non-federal match requirement, and for eligibility, non-federal dams, which does include state agencies, can apply. Additionally, localities, special purpose districts, and nonprofits can apply. Private dam owners must have an eligible project sponsor. The project sponsor assumes responsibility for the project, including compliance with the grant requirements, federal laws, receiving and spending grant funds. So private applicants, if they need a sponsor, would have to have a separate agreement with their project sponsor that outlines roles and responsibilities. So for grant requirements, there's a couple more grant requirements for the FEMA side. So in addition to being in compliance with the Dam Safety Grant Program, you have to have an approved emergency action plan. You have to have a FEMA approved local hazard mitigation plan that incorporates dam risks for that locality that you're applying within. And the locality must also have a floodplain preparedness plan that includes the dam in it, and or you can develop one within 12 months. The application deadline happens in two parts. In both cases, DCR will prepare the application and apply to FEMA, but we will need documentation from sub-applicants to do so. The Part 1 application is coming up on February 29th, and the Part 2 will be July 31st. The period of performance is 36 months, and typically reimbursements are processed quarterly. To go through a little bit more of the HHPD eligibility criteria, the dam must be non-federal, it must be classified as high hazard potential, it must have an approved EAP, and it must fail to meet the state dam safety standards and pose an unacceptable risk to the public, which is basically defined as having a known and documented dam safety deficiency, being in poor or unsatisfactory condition, or a fair condition with a population at risk greater than 1,000. So dams that are not eligible would include federally owned dams, private dams without a sponsor, hydroelectric dams, and dams built under the authority of the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, which includes NRCS. or dams built by NRCS. So we have been coordinating with dam owners and their consultants and representatives, and we've received a number of survey responses from state agencies, localities, and a few private dams, nonprofits, and a water authority for a number of different projects that, at least before review, they appear to be eligible under the different categories that FEMA is offering funding for. So we'll continue coordinating with this group of survey responses to prepare DCR's application to FEMA. If you think your dam is eligible and we miss you, you may get in touch with us. And generally, the surveys are editable, and if you have additional information that you want to provide, please reach out. So for the HHPD grant by the numbers, as I mentioned, it's 185 million nationwide, and we are projecting about 2 million, and that is based on the average percentage of our nationwide share across 3 years from 2020 to 2022. It does depend, what we end up getting does depend on the number of other states that make application and the eligible dams that they are submitting to FEMA for funding. On the state dam safety grant side, as you can see this year, we do have a substantial increase in funding available, going from 5 million to about 10.6 million this year. And for the total number of dams across since 2017, we're starting to approach 300 different dams that we've helped with grant funding. Okay, so we have another quiz coming up, or another poll, I should say. Let me go ahead and launch that. So the poll is, which grant program do you anticipate applying for funding this year? The state grant program, the federal grant program, both, or are you planning to apply in next year's grant? Okay, thank you all for participating. So it looks like a little over 50% are interested in the state grant program, and 25% are looking to apply in a future year grant round. About 17% are looking at applying for both grants, and about 6% are looking at the FEMA HHPD grant. Okay, that is good information to understand our audience, since we can't meet all you individually. All right, so with that, I will pass it off to Jake, our grants manager.
Hello everyone, my name is Jake Shaw. I'm the grants manager here for the Division of Dam Safety at DCR. I'll just take you through some high-level overview of the state dam safety program now. Next slide. So we have a couple different funding pools this year for our dam safety grant. First of all, we have up to $1 million available for dams of regulatory size with an undetermined hazard classification, including private or local government-owned dams of unknown hazard classification for project type 1, which is unknown hazard dams. Then we have $2 million available for dams of regulatory size for project types 2 and 3. These are private or local government-owned dams, and then high hazard dams will receive priority for funding in this category. And then lastly, we have about 7.6 available for dams that are privately owned and high hazard. These are for both project types 2 and project types 3. This is from our American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA funding, that was made available over the next 2 years. So only one application per dam for project types 3 for this funding, with a maximum request up to $1 million. Next slide, please.
Okay, for some fundamental updates to our 2024 grant manual, project type 1 is now open to dams with an unknown hazard classification, which does include previous letter of engagement recipients. Projects type 2 and 3, they are for dams with any determined hazard class, and previously they were for just these sections were just for high hazard dams. There is a greater amount of funding, as Jake mentioned, due to the ARPA funding restrictions for high hazard dams, and our rubric that we score grants will heavily favor high and significant. But certainly if you are working with a low or significant dam, you can submit and not be excluded prematurely. So for project type 2, plan, specification, engineering, and instrumentation, the main difference here is we are funding instrumentation projects this year. And for projects type 3, in previous years, which is construction projects, in previous years, the construction project had to bring the dam to full compliance and bring the dam under a regular certificate. While we will certainly still accept projects that do that, we would also accept ones where the dam remains under a conditional O&M. And an example of that could be the replacement of a principal spillway that reached the end of its service life. So after the rehab, the dam might still not meet the required SDF, but there would still be a dam safety benefit to doing such a project because it would guard against internal erosion or more frequent overtopping events. Additionally, we will accept a design build approach for dam removal and not require approved plans and specifications at the time of application. That is specific to dam removal projects. For other types of construction projects, we do require approved plans and specs at the time of application.
Okay, and I'll go through some definitions that are important to the state grant. First of all, a local government or locality means any county, city, town, municipal corporation, authority, district commission, or political subdivision created by the General Assembly or pursuant to the Constitution or laws of the Commonwealth or any combination of two or more of these entities. Private entities means dam owners, whether individuals, partnerships, corporations, or other non-governmental entities. This additionally includes, but is not limited to, homeowners associations, planned unit developments, and common interest communities as defined in the Code of Virginia. And then finally, maintenance means routine activities conducted by the dam owner for preventative maintenance, such as removal of woody plants and trees, addressing rodent holes, replacement of parts, systems, or components, and other activities needed to preserve or maintain the dam that do not require an alteration permit. Okay, and then all of our state grants have a match requirement. They all have a minimum requirement of a 50% match. This match may be a combination of funding sources, including federal dollars, so long as the fund does not contribute more than 50% of the total costs. Projects must have commenced on or after July 1st, 2023, and end no later than 2 years after an executed agreement, up to 3 years maximum with an approved extension. But do note here that projects funded from the ARPA grants will only have a 2-year period of performance with no opportunity for extension. Grant funds are dispersed on a reimbursement basis and only after the completion of the approved project. Okay, now over the grant timeline. So the grant application period opened on December 15th, where we posted the grant manual on the website. Applications are due on March 15th. Again, they'll be submitted by Indices by 4 p.m. Then after the review period, following the March 15th deadline, our regional engineers and our team will put together a recommendation for the Soil and Water Conservation Board, which will go to their meeting in either April or May to be approved. And then early summer, we'll announce awards following that Soil and Water Conservation Board meeting. Then 2025 through 2026 is the period of performance. So you have, in the winter of 2026, you will need to submit an extension request if you're planning on pursuing one. It must be submitted or received by DCR 120 days prior to the expiration of the grant agreement. And then the project deadline will be within 24 months of the executed grant agreement. So looking at Q2 of 2026. Reimbursement requests must be submitted within 90 days following the project completion date. And again, all projects funded through ARPA must be completed and reimbursed no later than October 31st, 2026.
All right, and so this slide is here to kind of compare between the different project types, the eligibility requirements. And one thing to note is, and project type 3 is going to have the most eligibility requirements. So starting with that, you would need to have an approved inundation study, and generally you would need approved plans and specifications, need to be under an operation and maintenance certificate at the time of application, and it's limited to 1 application per dam. For project type 2, the requirements are a little bit less. So there is a requirement to have a current engineer's inspection on file at the time of grant application, and additionally be under a O&M certificate. You may apply multiple applications for the same dam, so you can split up across different types of planning reports. There is also the option to kind of wrap them into one submittal. For project type 1, the requirement is before reimbursement, you have to be under a regular any kind of O&M certificate, and the dam must be undetermined in hazard class, and also you may submit multiple project applications for one dam. So continuing on project type 1, there's about $1 million of funding available, and as we discussed, it could be a local or privately owned dam. It must have an undetermined hazard class. You can submit multiple project types per dam, and those 3 project types, maximum of 3, would be the dam break inundation zone study, the emergency action plan, and the professional engineer's inspection. And prior to reimbursement, you must be under an O&M certificate, which can be submitted at the time of the reimbursement request. So some kind of basic frequently asked questions for project type 1 is the average cost of a professional engineer inspection. And what we would point folks to is on our grants page, we do have a list of the awards from 2023 to 2017. And these are expressed as 50% of the total cost of the project. The PE inspection does not determine the hazard class. A dam break inundation study does. So generally, we wouldn't expect a PE to provide a hazard classification without conducting the full dam break inundation study and submitting that to DCR. The O&M certificate application must be prepared with the professional engineer's support, and it must bear the seal of the professional engineer. And if you are interested in a list of professional engineers, you can reach out to your regional engineer and they can provide you with that list of engineers that we have recorded in submitting and getting applications approved in DSIS. Okay, dam break inundation studies are required for all dams, whether they are believed to be low, significant, or high hazard dam. If the dam is believed to be low, it may qualify for a simplified dam break inundation study conducted by DCR for a fee of $2,000. Additionally, if the dam qualifies for a special low hazard, then it does not require a full DBIS, but those are pretty rare cases, as it basically means the flooding would have to occur and be totally contained by the dam owner's property. So what are responsibilities in terms of development in downstream of dams inside the dam break inundation zone? So there's a benefit to having a dam break inundation zone mapped because localities will review plans of development against the dam break inundation zones that they have on file. And if the plan of development could change the hazard class of the dam or the spillway design standards of the dam, the locality would not permit the development without requiring either alterations to the plan of development to take that into account, or the developer would have to contribute to necessary upgrades to the dam to help it meet the new standard spillway design flood based on its changed hazard class. So with that, Aaron Bish, our mapping engineer, will discuss the simplified mapping program.
Hello. So yeah, I guess now at DCR, we were resuming our simplified dam break inundation zone mapping program. So for a fee of $2,000, we will perform a simplified dam break inundation zone study to determine if your dam is low hazard. And we recommend that you email either me or your regional engineer before applying to determine if your dam is a good candidate for the program. So we'll do a preliminary analysis of your dam if it looks like it'll likely be significant or high hazard based on what's in the downstream zone. We'll let you know, because if our simplified study finds that your dam is significant or high hazard, then the dam will still need a full DBIS study, and we won't be able to refund the $2,000 fee. But this is a good service for unknown hazard dams if you think it's probably low hazard, because the $2,000 is a lot less than what you would have to pay for of an engineer for a full dam break inundation zone study normally.
Okay, I will go into the next portion of the presentation. Can someone give me a thumbs up that they can hear me?
We can hear you.
All right. My name's Scott Thomas. I'm dam safety engineer for Region 3, which is southeastern Virginia. If you remember the map from before, it's the Carolina blue color. Basically goes from Lynchburg down to North Carolina over to the ocean front and up the eastern shore, south of the James, 17 counties and 11 cities. So I'm just going to talk a bit about the project type 2 stuff, which is plans, specs, and studies, and now some provisions for instrumentation. Just again, the $9.632 million of available funding is an allocation shared between project types 2 and 3. $2 million for local government or privately owned dams, and up to $7.632 million for privately owned high hazard dams. Some of the basic criteria, the dam has to be regulated by the Virginia Dam Safety Act, which also includes the Virginia Impounding Structure Regulations and DCR guidance documents. Generally, the first screening is a dam has to be 6 foot or greater in height and create a maximum impounding capacity of 50 acre-feet at the top of dam crest, or alternatively 25 feet or greater in height and create a maximum impounding capacity of 15 acre-feet at the top of dam crest. Acre-feet is a measure of volume. The dam has to be a local government or privately owned dam. Only one project type may be selected per each application. However, you can submit multiple applications for different allowable items. You have to have an approved and active conditional operation and maintenance certificate on file with DCR at the time of your application. So in some cases, you can make an application for your operation and maintenance certificate by the grant application deadline. And this is laid out on page 7 of the grant manual for project type 2. For the activity number 7 type of projects, installing a remote monitoring station or system, you would have to have an alteration permit application and record report. Record report is a DCR form and submitted through our dam safety inventory system, basically an as-built type document. It has to be submitted and approved during the time of the project performance period and prior to the reimbursement request. And lastly, the criteria: high hazard potential dams are given priority in the ranking. The next slide, please. So this is a comprehensive list of eligible activities. This is kind of verbatim from the grant manual. So if you need to, go back and review it, just look in the grant manual. But there's 7 main items, and first being what we would call a dam break DBIZ study, dam break inundation zone analysis, which includes a map, a dam break map, and a report which would define the hazard potential classification for the dam, which is in Virginia, that's either high or significant or low. Second item is emergency plan, either emergency action plan or EAP. Emergency action plan is for high and significant hazard dams, and EPP is emergency preparedness plan for low hazard dams. Third item is spillway, like taking a look at spillways and whether the dam can overtop. Item 4 is geotechnical type investigations. Item 5 is for engineering and design for a whole list of about 8 items. I'm not going to go through each of these, but kind of covers the gamut of all the different types of things you can take a look at with the way your dam operates and functions. An example would be taking a better look at the low level drain, whether you have one or don't, and coming up with a design to maybe put one in. There's an example drawing right to the right of, you know, a detailed plan for a low level type drain. Number 6 is coming up with final plans and specs. That's a drawing, basically, you know, drawings and specifications for a dam rehabilitation. It may include a final report addressing multiple elements of some of the other activities and consolidated into one grant application. Lastly, which is kind of, you know, new to the eligible activities, is remote monitoring system or a station, instrumentation for the purposes of monitoring rainfall and water levels in the lake. For example, a normal pool of a lake, you know, could drop in a sunny day breach type event, and you really wouldn't know unless you were standing there seeing it. But this type of instrumentation would tell you that there was a water level drop and would trigger, you know, some action. So, you know, generally these types of stations have cameras and float switches and on-site rainfall gauges and sensors and all kind of bells and whistles. And the next part of the presentation, you'll kind of learn about some of these systems on the district dams. I would just like to talk about number C, because I saw a question in the you know, the go-to webinar thing that said, if the grants, you have 24 months to finish, but part of this service cost for cellular service could be up to 4 years after installation. That's a good question, and I think one we're going to have to look into and kind of pan out a little bit better. But some of the thoughts off the top of my head is extensions can be granted for certain parts of the dam safety grant, but not for the ARPA. It depends where it's funded. So I think we're going to have to take a look at this and figure out, you know, how that's done. So go to the next one. Next slide. So just quick summary, you know, project 2, you need a regular 6-year or a 1 or 2 year conditional operation and maintenance certificate in place. Any grant deliverables must be approved before the reimbursement. For example, emergency action plan. If you got a grant to do that, we would have to review it and approve it. You must have a current DCR approved engineering inspection on file with DCR, sometimes called an annual inspection report. And that's done through our dam safety inventory system, DSIS. And lastly, the O&M certificate and the inspection that I just talked about could be submitted at the time of your grant application. So there might be some flexibility to allow it to be per page 7 of the grant manual at the time of the grant application deadline too. So That's it for me. I'll pass it over to our fine district engineer, Charles Wilson.
There we go. Got to remember to unmute. As I've been introduced, just so we're clear, I'm not with Dam Safety. I am Charles Wilson. I'm the district dam engineer, and I work for Soil and Water Conservation, and I assist the Soil and Water Conservation districts and state parks kind of as their engineer of record. And Dam Safety kind of reached out for me to talk to you all so that, you know, we've put a bunch of remote monitoring on, and this is just kind of sharing my experience with the process to kind of give you all an idea of what all would be involved, costs, and, you know, kind of things to think about and see if it's worthwhile for you guys to apply for this. Next slide. So we're going to cover two kinds of options. The first one I'm going to go into is your cellular remote monitoring equipment, which basically gets all the recordings and datas up to the web so you can see them using cellular systems, aka cell phone stuff. Next slide, please. The cellular unit that we used on our dams was the Onset Micro RX water level station, and I've kind of given you the information to the vendor if you're interested and kind of get an idea of what it is. This is pretty much a very simple plug and play kind of thing. You buy it, you create an account, you register it, you hook it up somewhere, you chuck the sensor in the water, and it magically starts working so long as, you know, you actually have cellular coverage at your location. It's a very easy, cost-effective, kind of off-the-shelf solution, and you can add all kinds of different things to this and turn it from just a simple water level to full-blown kind of one of those weather station setups. It just depends on, you know, how much you want to go into it. Next slide. Installation, you know, really is pretty simple. You just have, you know, you got to buy the equipment. We've mounted ours on a pole on the dam, but you can do different, you know, things depending on where you're at in your configuration. You know, from the unit to the water, we had some buried conduit. We kind of had a valve box, an intake pipe, and it was a very simple installation. Next slide. This is basically how we installed ours. So like at the top of the dam is where we had the pole where we installed the unit. We had conduit with the pipe to like a valve box or kind of a wet well right there before your normal pool. And then we just had a pipe that fed water into the valve box, wet well, for the sensor to read it. You can do stuff as simple as just installing it in the lake. There's all kinds of different ways to do it, but this is something we did for ease of maintenance. But this is kind of an example of, you know, what we were doing. Next slide. It wouldn't be a presentation without some pictures. So as you can see, this is where they were ditch witching in the conduit at one of our dams. Next slide. That's kind of what the unit looks like mounted on a pole. It is not big at all. It's probably, you know, 5 inches by 6 inches by 3 inches deep. Next slide. And just to give you an idea, that's kind of our wet well with the pipe feeding it into it. So it's kind of a pretty unintrusive installation, but, you know, wherever you decide to put them, you got to think about the fact that you will have instrumentation and stuff. Next slide. And this is the thing I'm sure everyone's interested in. Now, remind you, these right here are all kind of pre-COVID costs. So I have no idea how dramatically some of these might change. But, you know, as we were doing these, we kind of did a first phase installation where we picked several districts around the state and kind of slowly brought them online. And as you can see here, Blue Ridge District, if you're not familiar with that, that's kind of out Henry Franklin County. Culpeper District is, you know, Culpeper area. Hanover Carolines, you know, Hanover, that's where that dam. Mountain Castle is Craig County, kind of north of Roanoke. Piedmont is Prince Edward County, Farmville, and Thomas Jefferson is Louisa County. So we kind of had a good spread around the state, and you can kind of see the equipment costs, construction costs total, and I kind of broke it down on a average cost per unit. So depending on where you're at, you know, you can get these in the ground anywhere, probably nowadays from 5 to 12 to 15. It just all depends on what you're doing. Depending on your dam, I'll just let you know our flood control dams, we had a lot of conduit and cabling because we have a lot of dry storage. So if you have more of a standard conventional dam, you might not have as much conduit and pipe cost too, so you might have some savings, but this kind of gives you a ballpark of what you're looking at. Next slide. And this is just kind of to let you know is you got that, what all do you get? This is, you know, you can access your, once you have it up and running, you can access the data from a website interface. And you can see here, it kind of gives you your water level and it's recording some other stuff. And it just kind of, you know, you can see what's going on and it tells you when it works. Next slide. What I really like is not only do you get data, but it'll also give you graph of your lake level over time. And this is one of the things that, you know, the engineer in me likes, because we're seeing how that water level, you can see this one has a 2 peaks. So we had a storm, it started dewatering, we had another storm, and then it dewatered more. And this is some of the value you get with this remote monitoring, because you get a feel for how your lake reacts for various storms. Next slide. The other thing you can do is a dashboard if you have multiple dams, or even if you have one. We've set these up to where we get an idea of how close we are to triggering each of our emergency action stages, which is kind of our big focus on this remote monitoring, and how close we are to an overtopping event. But you can configure a dashboard to display whatever you want, as many different stages or triggers that you want. Next slide. The other thing that's really nice about these is whenever it's a predetermined trigger that you determine, you can get both text messages and emails letting you know if you have a high water event or, you know, an emergency action trigger. So it's a good thing, because we all know it only has emergencies are on 3-day weekends, Sunday at night. So these will, you know, let you, you know when things are happening when you don't normally out there at your dam. Next slide. So that kind of covered our cellular option, and we have some dams that are not exactly in places with good cellular coverage. So then we've had to move on to the more expensive satellite remote monitoring equipment to, you know, catch those places where we don't have cellular. We haven't fully implemented this. They've installed most of them in November and December, and we're slowly getting this up and working. So that's why it's kind of work in progress on some of the data. Next slide. Our vendor that we use for this is AMCI Wireless. They kind of do the satellite monitoring kind of program. As you can see, it's kind of a very similar thing, but I would kind of reach out to them and you can ask them, hey, this is what I want to do, and they'll kind of custom build something for your site and location. So their, you know, website's there, and you can scan the QR code, take you to their website to reach out to them. But next slide. In addition to that, they have partnered with a local vendor, Colonial Scientific. And so for any of you governmental entities, you can kind of reach out to Colonial and kind of do state procurement through them as a punch out catalog kind of thing. So I know that that's something both the districts and some municipalities have already kind of started taking care of, because it helps the procurement process. Next slide. The installation is pretty much the same, with one caveat is, you know, you have your equipment, you have your mounting pole, you have your conduit, you have some maybe pull boxes, but at the end of the day, instead of having that wet well, they actually run the conduit and the probe all the way to the bottom of the lake. And since it's also satellite, special installations required because they got to make sure the box can talk to the satellites and do all that magical communication stuff. So if you go this route, they do more of a full turnkey installation as opposed to you just being able to do maybe most of it yourself. Next slide. And as you can see here, this is kind of their standard panel hookup and their details, and it's very similar. Next slide. Here's a picture of one where we've kind of finished that installation. You can see it looked very similar to the last one, but this one's a little different because we actually went with a rain gauge on this. And so you can kind of see that there as well. Next slide. Just to give you an idea of project costs, this is kind of pulling it, I think, from the latest cut sheet from Colonial because our prices are a little different. But you're looking at, you know, $250 per unit for programming. For your cabling, you're looking at $341 per linear foot, you know, rounding up. Your pressure transducer, $1,400. They have to do a reference volume, not sure what that is, but I think that's kind of setting it up in the system, you know, $327. We actually went with upgraded solar panels, so that was an extra add-on. And then the standard panel with like the satellite thing. And this is where they kind of included the installation cost was like $8,511. So we were looking at an average cost per unit of, you know, a little under $12,000. And like I said, some of these had a lot of conduit and buried cable. So if you don't have that much, you would be surprised at how much that adds, you know, that $341 per linear foot kind of adds up when you're doing, you know, 100 linear feet and whatnot. Because not only does that have the cable, but you also have your conduit to protect it. Next slide. Just like I mentioned, there are some additionals that they offered. One of them that we have done on some of ours is a camera, and you're looking at, you know, almost $700 more just for the camera. And if you go with the camera, just know that there'll be more data you have to pay for, and the quality of the image, as you can see on screen, isn't, you know, the 4K we're used to, and that's because they're trying to save on the data transmission. So if you want to do a camera, you got to really think about, you know, what you want to see and what would give you some value. And the other item, like we showed in the picture, it has kind of a rain sensor, and as part of that, you can even set up triggers kind of like you do in your EAP for, you know, so many inches in an hour or so many inches over 6, 12 or whatever. They can work with that on the back end. Next slide. And this is where, you know, at the end of the day, you get all this, but it's the website interface that looks pretty cool. I actually kind of like this one better because they do a little graphic in the upper right-hand corner, kind of give you an idea where you're at. The water over the sensor gives you an idea how much rain you get, but you kind of got to do a little math. But on the left, as you're seeing, we're still kind of setting it up. They show water elevation and your triggers. And one interesting thing they do that's a little different is they also give you rates of increase or rates of drop, which is a whole other trigger, which we're slowly working with as like a kind of a value added thing that this system does. Next slide. And most like the other one, you get, you know, your alarm notifications where you'll get text messages and or emails. And like we show here is this one, we've set some triggers. So sometimes you might not actually get a lot of water in your lake yet, but if it'll tell you how much it's changing, and that's kind of an early indicator. So that's something we've been looking at as well. I think our new record is 20 inches in 1 hour of lake level rise, which, as you can imagine, that's a lot of rain and a lot of change. Next slide. That's kind of what you need to get into the equipment, get it on ground, get it ready to go. The other thing you need to think about, and this is some of the things I think I've saw questions about, is long-term costs. Next slide. is the data plan / web interface software. A lot of them are kind of, you pay one fee and that covers you. So for the cellular, it's basically $300 a year. That's all you pay every year. And I know a lot of these companies, if you go up front with them, you can prepay for a year, 2 years, 3 years, or 4 years, whatever. They're more than happy to take your money and, see you commit to that, long period of time. But as you can tell, the cellular we really like because it's pretty cost effective for what you get. The satellite, when we don't have a choice, that's what we're using. And as you can see, their service plan is, it's a little over almost $115 a month. So, that adds up over the course of a year. So those are things you need to keep in mind. And I want to say is that AMCI, they do more than just satellite. They also do cellular, and they also do some hybrid systems where that does cellular most of the time, but if cellular fails, it can go to a satellite backup. So there are options out there, and a lot of them are, there's other companies out there that do this, not just these. So I want to be clear about that but those are the companies we've had experience with for our actual units on the ground. And one other, long-term cost you got to think about is, batteries, pressure transducer sensors, depending on where they're installed. You might have freeze thaw. They're devices like anything else that are, in a lake, for a couple of years. Eventually they will fail or you'll have problems with it. And also your actual remote monitoring unit. I mean, it's kind of out and prominent depending where you're at. I'm surprised none of ours have been shot yet during hunting season. So fingers crossed that we don't have to deal with that. Next slide. And with that, I think that was it, right? There, Arthur?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Yeah, so we have a break here for Q&A. I see Scott's been busy answering people's questions in the chat, but if any of the other panelists want to pull up the questions and read some out loud, I'll start with Gerardo asked for a type 2 project engineering study. What documentation is required for establishing a cost? Would you want the engineer/consultant cost proposal? If so, any requirements for those proposals? I don't know if any of the panelists, maybe the regional engineers, want to grab that one. So generally what we recommend is if you can get quotes, a lot of times we do suggest trying to get more than one estimate and include that as your justification for your request for the grant amount. And obviously it's going to be easier to ultimately get reimbursed for less funding that is actually spent down than if you request too little and are awarded and then the project goes beyond the cost that you've requested.
Yeah, you're responsible for 100% of the cost in excess of the match. So keep that in mind and make sure your engineers are including, or yourself is including, a reasonable contingency in the cost estimate for construction or services.
So a question from Lynn: if the dam O&M certificate was approved in 2022 of a high hazard dam and the engineering inspection or re-inspection is due in 2024, is the engineering inspection eligible for the grant? And as long as the dam in particular has not requested, oh wait, no, so yeah, high hazard dams were not funding inspections. We are just funding inspections for dams with unknown hazard classification. And I guess the reason for that is the inspections are required already. So we're just kind of expecting dam owners to be taking care of their dams. And I guess there's other things that we would fund for high hazard, including more detailed plans and specifications for a remediation project or for construction. But the inspection itself is something that I guess during this grant year, for high hazard dams, the dam owners would be responsible for, and there wouldn't be grant funding for. Okay, another question from Pete. Is it possible to apply for funding for the dam break inundation study by the March 15th deadline if work hasn't yet been completed or contracted, but the intent is to have the work done by the July 31st deadline?
It sounds like there might be some confusion on the deadlines for submitting the work. So the deadline for starting the work, if you will, was July 31st of 2023. In other words, if you'd done the dam break study and wrapped it all up on June 30th, you would not be eligible. The next deadline after you're awarded the grant is the performance period for the grant, which I think varies by type of grant. Usually it's a year or two later than the award date. And Jake can probably explain a little bit more about extensions and deadlines.
Yeah, so it's a 2-year period of performance after the executed grant agreement award is made, and then 1 year potential extension aside from the ARPA funds. That's a case-by-case basis.
And FEMA has its own rules for the HHPD that are different than the states.
So in short, Pete, to answer your question, yes, it is possible to apply for funding by the March 15th deadline if the work hasn't been completed. You can complete the work after the award you've been awarded.
Yeah, as long as it didn't start, but yeah, exactly, before July 1st of last year.
The awards are done as a reimbursement, so you would be awarded after the March 15th deadline, complete the work, pay for the work, and then request a reimbursement from us. Additionally, Pete asked, the manual mentions tree removal isn't eligible for funding, but removal of trees is required for conditional O&M certificate. So wouldn't tree removal be grant funded eligible activity?
So the theory is that when a dam is built, it is built to the specifications that the state of Virginia has in the regulations, which insist that no trees or woody vegetation be planted on the dam or within 25 feet of the perimeter of the dam and spillway. So it's viewed as the owner's inadequate responsibility for maintenance of the dam. It could even be two owners before you, but nonetheless, once that is let to deteriorate, the responsibility for that is, the onus is on the owner. Now, removal of trees incidental to the construction work underway would be considered clearing and grubbing in most construction contracts. So bear that in mind, but we would not ever issue a simple grant to take out trees and that's it, or remove woody vegetation any more than we would issue a grant to remove rodents or other sort of common O&M type tasks, mowing the grass on the dam, for example.
Okay. And Gus asked if a dam owner can apply for both the FEMA and the state grant. Would it matter if the project was split into distinct phases? If you do have a dam or projects that are eligible for both grant programs, you can have your name in the running. You can submit a state grant in addition to be in the running for the FEMA grant. I would say that the FEMA grant is, the process is going to be a little bit longer of a process. So you might have a better idea of what's awarded from the state before you really know what the award from FEMA is going to be. And the review process on the FEMA grant is based on this project risk prioritization or project prioritization. That's pretty detailed and I think we're kind of anticipating it to be somewhat competitive. But if you have the ability to work with us on both of those grant programs and you're eligible, then that's not a problem. We'd be happy to work with you.
One of the purposes of the state grants is to put you in a position such that you would have some of your studies and things behind you before you applied for either engineering or construction grants from FEMA. The one program sort of feeds into the other one for those eligible high hazard dams that are in poor condition due to engineering reasons or are having a potential population at risk of greater than or equal to 1,000 people in fair condition.
Okay, I think we're gonna go ahead and answer one or two more questions and then start moving on here. So Miranda asked, how many years is a dam break inundation study good for? Our dam has one, but it's 7 years old. Would it be good to be proactive to have another one done for the grant process?
So for the dam break inundation zone studies, there is a state regulation that requires that if your study was done not using the Virginia state specific probable maximum precipitation, that you at least have your engineer do a spreadsheet analysis and find out whether the new values of rainfall are increasing, and that combined with the new curves the state issued for the shape of the rainfall hydrograph, that it would still be a more critical flood than the floods that were developed using the old federal guidance in HMR 51 and 52. I know that sounds very techy, but that's sort of how the law is laid out. The only times that we typically require new dam break study is in the case of a change in the regulation, such as described that happened in 2016, or if we found a perhaps significant error as we were reviewing the materials leading to an alteration permit to implement the change. So we always try and catch those during the review of the dam break inundation zone study, but occasionally something passes our review without being caught, and unfortunately the state regulations are the state regulations. EAPs, on the other hand, which are based on the DBIZ, the Dam Break Inundation Zone Study, require complete updates every 6 years and annual checking and revisions to phone numbers every year.
Okay, so we got most of the questions done. I know there's a few still left, but just to be mindful of everyone's time and try to keep on track, we are going to move on to project type 3 with Steve Bricker.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Bricker. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
All right. I am the regional engineer for Region 4, which is the southwestern part of the state. I'm here to talk to you today about project type 3, which is repair, safety modifications, or removal of dams. So these are, your physical work projects, not so much your studies and inspections and things. Up here in the upper right of this slide, you can see that we've got the set amounts of money that were set aside for different types of projects, and you're eligible for more money if you have, for instance, a regular or conditional O&M certificate on hand, or if this is going to get you into a position where you are ready for a regular certificate. The eligible activities include repairs or modifications to address static, hydrologic, or seismic failure modes, or the removal of an unsafe dam. Now note that this doesn't include removal of a dam just to rebuild a new one there. If you're going to remove it permanently, then this grant program is here to help you with the funding for that. There could be other repairs or safety modifications required by your conditional O&M certificate. But as we've mentioned a few times already, routine maintenance activities are not eligible for funding. This is really intended for bigger improvement projects, not for maintenance that should have been being done all along. But next slide, please. All right, so this is all the criteria here. I'm just going to briefly glance over them. We will be sending these slides out to everybody, or you can give your regional engineer a call or an email if you have questions on them. But basically, as we've mentioned a few times before, it needs to be a state regulated dam to be eligible for this program. It needs to be owned privately or by a local government, so no federal or state owned dams. You're allowed one application per dam on a project type 3. That doesn't prevent you from applying for a type 1 or 2, but we're not going to be issuing you 2 grants for different projects in this type 3 category. You need to have an approved certificate at the time of application. So if you don't have a certificate right now, and that application deadline is March 31st, you really do need to work on getting a certificate application submitted so that you'll be eligible for this grant program. You need to have an approved inundation study at the time of the application. I believe in the past we've said, if you have one submitted and we haven't had a chance to finish reviewing and approving it yet, you'll probably get by on that. You need to have the approved plans and specifications at the time of the application. You need to have, and after the project is completed, you do need to file a record report. And that is, anytime you submit an alteration permit, you're doing improvement projects or alteration projects to the dam, there's a report you need to submit to us at DCR that basically has all the before and after data for your dam so that we can update our inventory system with the latest and greatest, most up-to-date information. And of course, one thing that isn't mentioned here on this criteria, it's just more of a DCR requirement rather than a grant program requirement, is that if you are doing an alteration to the dam, you will need to submit an alteration permit application to us so that we can review it, verify that the plans are fully compliant with all of our laws and regulations, and also consistent with best engineering practices. Let's go on to the next slide, please. Okay, this here is the application checklist. When you put together your grant application, you will need to submit this application checklist. And this is just a way of making sure for you and for us that you have submitted all the information that we require. So you need a narrative, at least a paragraph or two, saying, why do you need assistance? You need to have the checkbox for, is there an operation and maintenance certificate? At the very least, you need to have applied for it. Have you filled out a application appendix A, which we'll be looking at in a moment? The scope of work. There's the need for assistance. There's scoring criteria, which we'll discuss briefly in a moment. The risk reduction benefits. How is this project going to benefit public safety? What are your goals and objections? Approach, milestone deliverables, your maintenance plan. So, if you're making changes to the dam, you have an operating and maintenance plan as part of your certificate now, but these improvements, these alterations might change that. So we want to make sure that you have fully considered this and that you have a valid and reasonable maintenance plan going forward. And if there were any alternatives that you considered, we'd like to see, what alternatives did you consider? Why were they rejected? Were they too costly? Did they just not make sense? That sort of thing. We need some supporting documentation. Basically, if you're a local government, you need a resolution or other document authorizing the request for funding. So we need to prove that you've got the ability to pay for this, that you have the authority to pay for this. If it's a non-locality applicant, such as like a homeowners association or something, we need a signed pledge agreement or other authorizing documentation from each contributing organization, just verifying that because this is a reimbursement after the fact, we need to verify that you have the ability to pay for the project up front. Need a budget and narrative of how the funding is to be allocated. Next slide, please. And this is the scoring criteria that we mentioned. If you have any questions about this when you're filling it out, your engineer should know how to do this. Also, your regional engineer can probably help you with this. But basically, the idea is we're going to have a lot of applications coming to us. And if we have more requests than we have dollars to hand out, we use these scoring criteria to kind of rank the projects in terms of which one is a better bang for your buck, which one is delivering the most good to the public. So, we're looking at the first few questions are just verifying that you are indeed eligible for the grant program. And then by the time we get to question 5, that's when we're getting into the scoring criteria, the size of your dam. And again, your regional engineer can help you if you don't know for sure. The size of the dam plays a big role. The number of residential units within the probable dam break inundation zone. So if you haven't done a DBIZ study, then you can talk to DCR and we'll help you figure this out. If you received a letter of engagement in the last couple of years, that number can be found there on that. Will public roadways, public utilities, and or commercial structures be impacted? Again, if you got a letter of engagement, that information will be provided there. If not, your engineer or us at DCR can help you answer that question. Next slide, please. What is the most common land use downstream within the likely dam break inundation zone? Take a look at what's downstream of you. Is it mostly residential? That's a much higher hazard for human life. Is it mostly agricultural? Is it other unknown? What is the public use of the impoundment created by the dam? And this is just kind of rating how much. Is this a privately held dam and only people who live in your homeowners association have access to the water? Or is this something that anybody in the state can come by and boat or fish? That's going to play a role in how we prioritize this. And then we'll want to have your eligible project type. Is it project type 1, 2, or 3? And in those, which type of project is it? Is it a dam break inundation zone study? Is it a design report? Is it a spillway improvement? And those will be used. Those are weighted very heavily in our scoring criteria. And next slide, please. That is the end of my session here, my section of this. If anyone has any questions, suppose we got another Q&A period coming up after Melissa talks about this, don't we?
Yes, we may. We'll certainly take questions at the very end, or at least between the state grant and the FEMA grant sections. And if folks want to stay on the line afterwards to be called up to speak with us, they can do that, and that will happen at the very end.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melissa Memarian, and I am the Data Services Support Technician for DSIS. So when you're emailing DSIS, I'll usually be the main individual responding to your emails. So let's begin. Next slide, please. So this slide is showing what the DSIS access form will look like. And today I'll be assisting in how to fill out this application. There will be a slide at the end of this section with web addresses at the end, and it'll show where you can find this document as well as any other supporting DSIS documentation. Next slide, please. So there are 2 levels of access that can be granted to DSIS users. First one is participant access, which basically allows users to view, upload, download, and submit information for a specified dam or dams. And you can also apply for and submit any key regulatory documents with participant access. This type of access does require a dam owner or owner representative signature for each requested dam. Another type of access you can use is read-only access, which allows users to view information only for a specific dam or regions, and you must specify in the form which dams or regions you'd like to access. So read-only access, you cannot edit data, you can only read it. Next slide, please. So now I will briefly go over the different sections of the form. This first section is pretty self-explanatory. You just put in your user information in order to set up your account. And please make sure to also include your email address in this section so that your DSYS username and temporary password can be emailed to you. There's also a section for any additional comments if you need to, or if you feel the need to provide any. Next slide. So the initial access section of the form requires users to check one box only to indicate if you would like to create a new account or if you would like to modify, disable, or re-enable an existing account. So you just click whatever box in the initial access part of the section. For role access, this requires users to check one box only to indicate, again, if you were trying to create a read-only account or a participant account. And keep in mind that participant accounts, like I mentioned, do require a DAM owner's or representative's signature. Next slide, please. So in this section of the form, you will record the DAM inventory number and DAM name for each DAM you would like to be added to your read-only or participant account. And if you don't have the inventory number, that should not be a problem. As long as the DAM is in our system, you can just give the DAM name and we can probably look it up for you. You can also attach a separate list if you need to add more DAMs to this page. Next slide. So if you're not sure which DAMs you would like to be added to your account, you can actually request regional access instead of listing the DAMs individually. But please note that participant access cannot be provided for entire DAM or regions. Only read-only access can be provided for this request. So you would just click on which region you would like to see, or you can click on all regions to view data for all regions. Next slide. So this section is for DAM owners and representatives only who are requesting participant access. These users must check their relation to the DAM listed or the regions checked. If you are a DAM owner requesting participant access, your name, signature, and date is only required at the bottom of page 2 of the access form. If you're a representative or consultant, you must provide the DAM owner's name, signature, and date in this section, as well as your own name, date, and signature at the bottom of page 2. If you are a public entity, meaning you only want read-only access, you need to provide your name, signature, and date at the bottom of page 2 only. So you can just click on public entity right here and put your signature at the bottom of page 2. Next slide, please. This section of the form displays the access terms, conditions, and disclaimers. So make sure to read everything here in order to gain access to the DSYS website before you put your signature on it. Next slide, please. So after you read the terms, conditions, and disclaimers, you must provide your full name, signature, and date in the last section of the access form. And finally, once your form is complete, you can either submit your application by email with a preferred to dsys@dcr.virginia.gov, or you can mail your application to the Department of Conservation and Recreation's address, which is listed on the form as well. Next slide.
Okay, and there was one question, DSYS question that came through the chat, Melissa, that you might want to take a look at. All right. So I'm just going to briefly go over some of the application process within our website, which is DSYS. So that's going to cover just the overview of DSYS, the Dam Safety Inventory System, as well as the grant application process. And we do have a poll really quick, so let me see if I can pull this up. Okay, so it looks like the majority of our audience are occasional users of DSYS, and now it's the majority have never used DSYS before. We got about 40% have never used it before, and 40% are occasional users, so it's kind of a dead heat right now. And about 20% are regular users, and we have 6% are new users. Okay. Thank you everyone for participating in that poll. Go ahead and close that. And so this is the link to our website, which can also be found, well, this is a link to DSIS, which can also be found on our website. When you go through the registration process with Melissa, you'll land in the DAM search grid if you're a view only or read only user, and this will allow you to search and filter all the dams that you have access to. You can also right click on any of them and print out a report, which will give you a map and kind of an overview of the dam. If you click into any of the rows on that grid, it will take you to that dam specific page. If you have a participant account, then you will land at the application search queue, which will show you the status of all the applications that you have submitted. And so those statuses might be admin review, submitted, or revisions needed. And once the application has been approved, it would no longer show up in that queue. So our regional engineers sort of live and die by the application queue. So make sure to, if you want them to see something, then make sure it goes into submitted status, and it will show up on their queue as well. So if you click on any of the rows, it will take you to that specific application. And as I said before, if it's approved, it won't show up anymore, but you would be notified that it's been approved. So when you click on a specific dam in DSIS, you kind of have navigation on the left-hand side, and in the green rectangles, all this basic information, which includes upcoming expirations for like inspections and O&M certificates under that event tab. The general would be kind of just overall information about the dam and its regulatory agency, the size of the dam, things of that nature. And it gets, into more technical information. And there's also the contacts tab. Additionally, we have a few different maps, and we have tabs signified inside the red rectangles, and those tabs are all where you'd actually submit applications. So there is also a general attachments tab, and that can be for any kind of documentation, maybe like a historic or archival documentation that you're not actively submitting and requesting DCR to review. So you're more than welcome to use DSIS as a digital file for your dam and help us build records for these dams, so that's, if they change hands or anything, it's easier for the next person to know, the current status of the dam and some of the historic information about it. All right. So this is once again the event tab, which shows automatic reminders of expirations, so that you'll know when your next inspection date is coming up. And DSIS will issue notices via email at 150 days and 90 days. And in order for that to happen, you would need to be added as a contact to the dam, and contacts must have valid email addresses. So as a participant, you should have the ability to view, add, and edit contacts on your dam. And so if you're adding a contact, you would click on the contacts tab, and then you have the option to add a new contact or add an existing contact. For the existing contact, you would filter our kind of global contacts list and be able to add an existing one, which will save you some data entry time, as well as not create duplicate contacts in our system. If the person you're searching for does not exist, then you have the ability to add a new contact. Once you have done either added an existing or a new contact to that dam, you can basically choose sort of the role of that contact, whether or not they're a consultant, a professional engineer, or if they are the owner or the owner representative. And keep in mind, if the contact has an organization associated with it within the contact details, the organization is sort of what's individually, or what's held as basically the owner of the dam. And so that actual organization will be printed on the O&M certificates, for example. Okay, so looking at the grants tab. So once you come here, if you have not submitted a grant before, you have sort of an empty landing page with an add grant button. And this will be fairly self-explanatory. For applicant type, there's two options, private entity or locality. And you'll hit add, and then that will take you into kind of a draft grant application. And there's a number of fields, and for some of these kind of like longer answer fields like budget, narrative, and project scope, we recommend that you type these up in a word processor, which would allow you to save your work on your local computer. And that way, if you have an internet issue or something like that, or if you accidentally hit cancel, you'll still have your verbiage that you've written up, and you can paste those relevant sections in. So for the budget narrative, this is one of the requirements of the grant application, and we are asking for a detailed breakdown of how the funding is proposed to be allocated between the applicant and the funding, so showing that cost break, and as well as breaking down the salaries, fringe benefits, travel, equipment, supplies, construction, and other direct costs. And we also do require the applicant to demonstrate the ability to fully fund the project to completion. So that is an additional requirement that you would be able to provide some evidence to us to meet that requirement. And to the right is just sort of a basic example of what that might look like for a PE inspection. So for the next requirement is just selecting the project type, and that should be pretty straightforward. So we have a drop-down menu, and it will line up with all the different eligible project types. You can submit multiple separate grant applications under projects 1 and 2, and for projects 3, only submit one grant. There are some additional required fields, which would be project cost and just for kind of the technical data input side. We only are accepting decimal values or integers. Please don't put commas or $signs. And for the contacts, you can put yourself in, or you can put an additional contact. So there's ability to add multiple contacts, and all of those folks that are added will get automatic email updates on status changes of that grant application. And for the project scope, this is another requirement of the grant application. And in addition, it can be submitted, all this material or similar material can be submitted as like a separate PDF attachment, but you also can paste in this input data or this input field here. And it should include a detailed description of the need for assistance, the work to be conducted, and how it would address the need. Identify the risk reduction benefits to be achieved by the project goals and objectives, and any of the details about the approach and milestones and deliverables, if applicable, the maintenance plan, and any alternatives that were considered for each grant project type. There are some eligibility questions once you fill out those kind of preliminary or those primary questions. And these are, basically kind of a just double checking. If you've submitted for that same project before, then you wouldn't be able to apply for it again. So for that question 1, you'd have to submit no for that you have not requested funding for that same project in the past and been awarded. You have to provide evidence of the ability to fully fund the project to completion. So you'd have to answer yes for question 2. And for question 3, for a high hazard dam, you have to show that you are either maintaining an O&M certificate or making an effort to maintain an O&M certificate. So basically, to move on to the next section of the grant application, you have to answer these questions that way. And then once you do that, a pop-up will appear and you can hit continue application, and that red cancel application kind of catches your eye, but don't click on that. Just hit continue application. And then you will get into the scoring criteria. And what I've highlighted here is If you do not know, you can put unknown or 0. You can also reach out to whoever you're working with this grant application, whether it's your regional engineer or a consultant that has a proposal in. If you need it, if you want kind of additional information on how to answer these if you're not sure. A lot of this information would be available via your dam break inundation study if you have one of those. Generally, unknown or 0 is going to rank or give you like kind of the lower score, but we just ask everyone give us a accurate estimate for these if they don't have a dam break inundation study. And the regional engineers will review these individually and make adjustments if needed. So for the public use, one of the things to point out is that a private or restricted access community does not qualify as a public access. So once you've filled out some of those scoring criteria questions, you are then have successfully entered and saved a draft grant application. So when you see this status of development, please think of the word draft. And what that means is it's not fully submitted, but you have like a copy of the grant that meets all the minimum data and data field requirements so that you can save it. And then you can go in and make any edits and updates as needed up into the application deadline. One thing to note is once you do save it as submitted, it is sort of locked down from further editing. So certainly make sure to double check everything that you have submitted, any attachments, and the numbers reflect what you're asking for before you save it and submit it. To talk about how the attachment tab works, so there is this additional tab underneath the details tab that we've gone through, and this just allows you to submit supporting documents, including like a PDF of the actual proposal and grant application with all the required appendices. And we sort of have a way that we name files. So this is just here for reference. If you put your inventory, 6-digit inventory ID, and then a code that refers to the document type, and then the date, that is the preferred way to name a file and submit it into our system. Additionally, we do accept pretty much all document file types, which could include PDFs, Word documents, or a zip. And we recommend you use zip, like put a bunch of things in a folder and zip it. If you're, for example, submitting like 50 JPEG photos to us, we'd prefer that as a single zip file rather than 50 individual files. So once it's been submitted, as I mentioned, it will get locked down and it can't be edited further. If you do need to make changes, you can reach out to us and we can go in the back and change it back to a draft. So you can reach out to us for that, and for other questions, you can reach out to Melissa related to DSIS, and for kind of engineering questions, please reach out to your regional engineers. All right. And we got Kim and Scott up next.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kimberly Gaines. Scott Peterson and we are the grant specialists for dam safety, floodplain management. Next. Grant funds will be dispersed on a reimbursement basis and only after the completion of the approved project. I've been on this call since 2 o'clock, and I think we can't stress that enough. And we're going to continue to say it, because it's very important. For DSF PPAF reimbursements, DSF PPAF reimbursements are submitted after the completion of each project. However, the HHPD progress reports are due on a quarterly basis, regardless of the activity. If there is no activity, you are still required to submit a progress report. If there is or are any activity or incurred expenses, please submit that information on a timely basis within 30 days after each quarterly period. All projects are eligible for a 1-year period of performance extension, except those funded by the American Rescue Plan Act, also known as ARPA. All projects funded through ARPA funds must be completed and reimbursement requests submitted no later than October 31st, 2026. That is very important. If we don't receive your request in a timely fashion, the funds may be rescinded. Next. Submit reimbursement requests within 90 days following passage of the authorized project completion date. What do you submit when you for your reimbursements? Here's the list. You need to submit a completed and signed reimbursement request form. That's Exhibit E. We need the form of requisition completed. That is Exhibit D. We also need the certificate of the consulting engineer form. It needs to be signed by the consulting engineer, then forwarded or routed to the DCR regional engineer. Once the regional engineer will review the deliverables for the specific project. Once he has reviewed the deliverables for the awarded project, he will sign off and forward the form back to the applicant. And also needed is the proof of payment and all detailed invoices for the specific project. We, with the proof of payment, we mean canceled checks, redacted bank statements, and or some type of accounting system report showing the name of the grantee on the form somewhere, and you have the invoice date, invoice number, something that we can reconcile the proof of payment against the invoices. You submit the reimbursement packet. You can email it to us to the email on the screen, dam@dcr.virginia spelled out .gov. This email account is monitored on a daily basis. If you do not have that capability or access to a computer, what have you, we do accept mail documents, and the address is listed on the screen. Please keep in mind, invoices must be detailed and specific to the project awarded. And you providing specific details to determine the work and hours completed related to the approved project. Disclosure. I've been doing this for like 5 years. If you have one dam and you have several projects approved and you submit your reimbursement request, we ask that you do not combine the documents together. This will delay your process for reimbursement. Why? Because it's time consuming. We may have all the information or we may not. And so please submit each project separately with all the required documentations. Next. Here are a sample of what to expect to receive in your grant agreement, which will come from VRA. VRA will have Exhibit D, the Certificate of Consulting Engineer form. Next. And Exhibit E and the grant agreement. So keep these forms, and when the project has been completed and paid for, then you fill out these 3 attachments along with the invoices and proof of payment and submit it to DCR. Next. And thank you for your attention. Feel free, if you have any questions, we're here. The grants team is here to help you with your reimbursement. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Kim. And we're sort of now wrapping up the DSPPAF grants part of the presentation. And next slide. We wanted to just kind of summarize for you how the period works. We've talked about some of these dates in terms of the earlier questions that we answered, but as you see, the grants period did open back in December and closes on March 15th. I believe it officially closes at 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time. The awards will be announced typically after our spring Soil and Water Conservation Board meeting that approves the grants occurs. That typically happens around June. And at that point, then the grants team changes the status from under application to approved and begins the process of mailing out the both the awarded grants and the non-qualifying grants letters to inform the applicants. And after that, you have that performance period. We can do a one-year extension. I'm just kind of looking at this calendar for a minute here. Jake, earlier you had said 2 years period of performance from the award of the grant, but you recommend that they apply for the extension ahead of the grant's expiration. It looks like you've got it says a 1 year extension may be granted at the discretion of DCR 120 days prior to the expiration of the grants agreement. So be conservative. You can do it 150 days ahead, just don't wait till 90 days ahead because that would rule you out. And then finally, the final project then gets submitted at the end of the period that was extended. Next slide. So there's a number of resources on our DCR webpage, the same one we've been referring to. If you're looking for ideas of other successful grant recipients and what funding was involved, there's a list of all of our grants going clear back to 2017 in this website. And next slide. And then we have some resources available as well in a Google folder, and I would defer to Arthur on how you might access the Google folder as a member of the public, or you may have to go through DCR staff. Maybe you can elaborate on the Google folder, Arthur. Next slide.
Yeah, so it's a publicly accessible Google folder, and it will include the slides as well as links to the recording, as well as I think we had a question about the forms, which are in PDF format at the end of the grant manual. So there are a couple forms like the scoring rubric and application checklist, which we do ask people submit along with their application. Those will be provided in that Google folder as a Word document, which should make it easier for folks to complete them and not have to print them off.
Thank you. And next slide.
That will go off, go out to all attendees of this training.
So again, we come to another pause for any questions that you might have about the reimbursements, the grants processing, what some of the requirements might be in terms of documenting your expenses incurred for the grants, etc. So can someone who's monitoring the questions in the chat box, please, or in the questions box, tee up the first question for us to address?
Sure. So Candace asked, once you have completed the project, where do you submit the documentation for reimbursement? Do you just upload in the attachment section of the DSIS, I think?
I'll punt to Kim on that one. Or Jake. Question is how do you go about submitting the reimbursement? US mail, DSIS, email?
Yes, reimbursements are encouraged to be submitted to the dam safety inbox, which is again dam@dcr.virginia.gov. They can also be sent in via physical mail to the address that we had on the slide. Email is more effective, but if you prefer physical mail, that's also acceptable.
Great.
Okay. And Dan
Next
asked if the application in DSIS can be populated and submitted without need for separate attachments. Is there still a need to send anything by email or mail, or does the DSIS submission satisfy the submission requirements? I think that we would recommend you submit attachments as supporting documentation, because if you just use those few fields in DSIS, I think your grant application is gonna look a little sparse, and we definitely like to see documentation. And that could include the quote from the engineer consultant, as well as evidence of the ability to fund the project. And I think that I might be missing something else that you'd want to attach. But essentially, you know, it's your opportunity to kind of sell us on the project. So we're going to get more information from you if you're able to provide kind of a little bit more of a narrative, maybe have some photos, some site maps, things like that. It doesn't have to be 50 pages long, but certainly if you can kind of capture what your proposal is in a nutshell and provide good evidence and documentation to support it, that's what we'd recommend you do.
Great. You may get requests from the grant review team if there appears to be something that's not quite right. They'll often reach out to the dam owner or engineer to resolve.
You know, the thing that I was going to mention, so the scoring rubric and the, yeah, I guess just the scoring rubric, that is part of the DSIS form. So I don't know if they have to print that out and fill it out and scan it and submit it, because that's part of DSIS. So that might be something you could skip, and we probably wouldn't penalize you for that in terms of doing it as an additional attachment. All right, Janet asked, will a grantee be informed if they receive an ARPA award so that the different requirements are understood, i.e. no extension available for an ARPA grant?
Jake,
that is a really good question.
Yeah, you will definitely be notified. The grant agreement will be slightly different. We manage the ARPA agreements in-house, so it'll be evident in the award letter. It'll be coming directly from DCR rather than through VRA, and it'll be made explicit in your award letter. So definitely.
Right, and that wraps up all our questions that we have so far.
Excellent.
So
that wraps up my slides.
Yep.
Okay, then with that, we'll move on to our last section, which is an overview of the FEMA HHPD grant program. Again, I'm Jade Shaw, the grants manager for the Division of Dam Safety. This one's quite a bit different from the state grant in a variety of ways, but to start off, the primary way is that instead of you all as dam owners applying for this grant directly, Virginia DCR is the actual applicant to the federal government through FEMA, and we will be collecting eligible projects as part of our application package to the federal government. And as Art referenced earlier, we've already sent out a survey for those projects we've identified as eligible. So if your project is eligible, you should have already been contacted by DCR and responded to the survey. But again, if you feel after this presentation that your dam does qualify and you did not receive any contact from us, do feel free to reach out. Okay, so next slide. So here's the timeline overall. I'll go into details about the application phases later, but essentially the application period opened on October 30th of 2023, and it's going to close on February 29th of 2024. That is the first round of the application. There's actually 2 application phases. This first one is sort of the initial. We've identified and packaged a list of all of our identified eligible dam projects. That will be sent to FEMA. And once they have that number and do sort of the background work, they will determine our state allocation for the award. And then the proposed award notice is on April 8th. And then we have until July 31st to put together the more full detailed scope of work package for the actual project once we have a funding amount. And the period of performance on this grant program is 36 months. Next slide. So here's just an overview provided by FEMA. So eligible rehabilitation projects include technical planning, design, and construction activities towards the repair, removal, or structural or non-structural rehabilitation of eligible high hazard potential dams. And eligible dams include non-federal high hazard potential dams that fail to meet minimum dam safety standards, pose unacceptable risk to life and property, and have an emergency action plan. Next slide. So here's a bit about applicant and sub-applicant eligibility. Again, the actual applicant is DCR, and we're going to submit a list of eligible high hazard potential dams with our application on February 29th. They're going to be submitted in the table format with the NID data as this slide specifies. But for our sub-applicants who are our dam owners, the qualifications are that they must be listed in NID with a classification of either poor or unsatisfactory, or have a classification of fair with the population at risk or PAR greater than 1,000. It has to be located in a jurisdiction with an approved hazard mitigation plan that includes all dam risk. And then FEMA will use that list to calculate our funding appropriation based on the scoring criteria that they have and the projects we've identified. And then once we get that allocation, as I said, we'll put together a full scope of work application for that July deadline. Next slide. So again, for sub-applicant eligibility, the dam owner and the dam must be acting in accordance with state dam safety program guidelines. They must comply with regulations regarding labor and wage rates under contracts. They must have a FEMA approved hazard mitigation plan that addresses all dam risks. And they must have or will develop a floodplain management plan to reduce the impacts of future flood events in the area protected by the project. And I'll go more into that on the next slide. So regarding the floodplain management plan, the floodplain management plan requirement applies to construction projects only, not scoping projects. A floodplain management plan must be in place to reduce the impacts of future flood events in the area protected by the project, and it must be developed no later than 2 years after the project agreement is executed or when the grant award is accepted. And it must be in place and implemented no later than 2 years after the date of completion of a dam rehabilitation construction project. So the good news there is that even though this floodplain management plan is a bit of an extra requirement from the dam safety grant, you don't have to have it in place to be qualified as a sub-applicant. You just must develop it as part of the project itself. So next slide. So the floodplain management plan must include and address the following: potential measures, practices, and policies to reduce loss of life, injuries, damage to property and facilities, public expenditures, and other adverse impacts of flooding in the area protected by the project, plans for flood fighting and evacuation, and public education, risk communication targeting communities in inundation areas. Next slide. So the other requirement of the HHPD program is the Environmental Planning and Historic Preservation, or EHP checklist. So all HHPD grant program applications require EHP review, and they must comply with federal EHP laws, executive orders, regulations, and policies as applicable. EHP review is completed by FEMA before the project initiates. And the review may require preparation of written analyses and consultation with resource and regulatory agencies. And important to note here that DCR, as the state applicant and your state agency for dam safety, will be providing all the resources you need in education regarding how to complete this EHP review. We'll provide a checklist and guidance on how to complete this information. So you don't need to be an expert in EHP to partake in the plan or partake in the project application. Next slide. So again, the EHP grant recipients are responsible for providing information necessary for EHP review. So DCR will be responsible for providing that to FEMA, and will, solicit that information from our applicants, our sub-applicants. And site-specific information is needed for projects that physically affect the environment by physical work or ground disturbing activities, such as coring or trenching for site analysis and construction. So this site-specific information might describe the scope of work. It might include maps or images that show the boundaries of the work taking place, engineering drawings, and copies of correspondence with federal or state agencies that are related to such activities. Next slide. So yeah, there's also a non-federal cost share or match on this project, as well as the dam safety, but this one is slightly less. than the dam safety grant, requiring only a 35% non-federal cost sharing requirement. Cost sharing can be in kind or match, meaning that you can use the value of equipment, goods, or services contributed directly to the success and management of the project as your match. Federal funding is available for up to 65% of the eligible activity and costs. The remaining 35% must be derived from non-federal sources, again, which can be in kind. The non-federal cost share or match can either be derived from the applicant, subrecipient, or a combination of both. In this case, for Virginia, it'll be from the subrecipients. And additional information on the use of federal programs such as like FEMA's Safeguarding Tomorrow program or the Army Corps of Engineers loan program is available for use as well. Next slide. So as I referenced earlier, there's 2 phases of the application. Due on February 29th is the initial application package. And again, this is FEMA will review our application for completeness and eligibility, and they'll take a look at our brief scoping narratives that are included from the information that are gathered from the information provided in the survey responses. After part 1 is complete, FEMA will notify the states and territories of the funding amounts that we all qualify for. The state applicant must include the following 5 documents in the initial application package, and that's the list of eligible high hazard potential dams, the proposed budget, the statement of insurances by the signed authorized state official, and the state administrative plan. So obviously those last 2 items will be only applicable to DCR, not to you all as sub-applicants. Next slide. And then there's part 2 of the application, which again is due on July 31st of 2024. It's the scope of work package. This is the more detailed package we provide once we actually have a funding amount. We'll develop and submit a scope of work package for all the dams that are proposed for funding. This includes a narrative of how and why the projects were selected for funding, the quarterly milestone work plan, the EHP checklist that I mentioned earlier, and the budget narrative. And again, must be submitted no later than July 31st, 2024. Next slide. That might be the last one. Yep.
And we circle back to Q&A. So thank you, Jake, for that lovely discussion on the HHPD grant program. So from here, we are finished with our slide material, and we still have the opportunity, if there are questions, I think we might be caught up on the Q&A in the chat. If folks want to raise their hand and speak with us, they may do that in the last few minutes here, and we will be happy to stay on the line. So I will start looking through the chat, or excuse me, looking through the attendee list to see if I see any raised hands. And folks are welcome to just type as well, and we'll monitor that. But otherwise, I guess I'll let Mark kind of sign us off. So not seeing hands raised or new questions coming through the chat, I think we might be done. Well, thanks everyone for attending today, and we hope it was an informative 2 hours for you all, and we got to cover 2 grant programs and hear from a lot of our excellent team here at DCR, and we're really looking forward to working with you all on reviewing your grant applications and helping you through the process and getting some cost share funding out to dam owners across the state, and all to help protect lives and property and to preserve our natural resources of this state. So thanks everyone.
And I'm assuming we have no hands raised for the people that wanted to verbally participate. Is that right?
That's correct. I don't see any hands raised or new
Perfect.
questions.
Well, on behalf of our director, Matt Wells, for the Department of Conservation and Recreation, again, we appreciate your continued interest in our programs and look forward to working with you to help make Virginia dams safer. Thank you all very much.